Babylon's Banksters, Unusual Guest. Babylon's Banksters, Unusual Guests. You're listening to World Reading Club, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc. Presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus comes to us from Babylon's Banksters, The Alchemy of Deep Physics, High Finance, and Ancient Religions. Yesterday I left off on a section that began to get into something some people who might have heard some weird and crazy conspiracy theories about the Bilderberg group. And I read the section 4, Tentative Conclusions and Implications, the Standard Interpretive Temptation, which concluded with the statement about this closed system, physics, economics, and philosophy in general, that says that because of that closed system, it is by its own lights and philosophy inevitably doomed. If anything emerges from these brief considerations, it is this: in the emerging global community, an open system physics is ultimately the key to open systems of economics, to open conceptual systems, and to open systems of politics and finance. This deep and profound relationship between physics, finance, and political order is, of course, not unknown to the Bilderberg group or other such groups, as their own active suppression of such physics and cognate technologies attest. The real question that shall preoccupy us throughout the remainder of this book is exactly why that relationship should even exist, to outline its salient features, and to examine certain aspects of how it has manifested itself in history. And going on to section marked C, it continues. The title of that is Unusual Guests at the First Meeting and the Alternative Explanation, Detente. As previously indicated, the standard interpretation of the group and its surrogates as a monolithic, omnicompetent, and omnipotent bloc does not take into account some very significant facts that bear directly upon the interpretation of those early Bilderberger meetings, including, especially the first ones around 1954 to 1960. These facts may be distinguished into three classes. 1. The presence of two unusual guests with prominent Nazi backgrounds at the first meetings. 2. The wider context of post-war survival of a Nazi international and its financial and political capital and objectives. And 3. The occurrence of events subsequent to the first Bilderberg meeting, indicative of some sort of understanding between the Anglo-American banking elite and the Nazi international, each of which had their own globalist agenda for world domination. Each of these points must be examined in some detail in order to appreciate their significance for an understanding of at least one of the probable purposes for the establishment of the Bilderberg group. So 1. Two prominent guests with Nazi backgrounds. Most researchers on the Bilderberg group have noticed the presence of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands as the instigator and chairman of one of its first meetings in the 1950s, and some, Jim Mars for example, have also noted that Bernhard was a former SS officer as well as a vice president for the notorious gargantuan German chemicals cartel IG Farben. But there is another significant figure present in those meetings as well, and it is a combination of these two men that indicate there may have been yet another hidden purpose in the founding of the Bilderberg Group. That man is Deutsche Bank Chairman, Sovereign Military Order of Malta member, and IG Farben, Daimler-Benz, and Siemens Board of Directors member, Dr. Hermann Joseph Abs. In addition to those directorships on Germany's most powerful and largest bank and some of its largest corporations, including Siemens and IG Farben, Abs, during his tenure as partner of the private bank of Delbruck, Schickler & Co., located in Berlin, became a close associate of the Nazi Pater Reichsleiter and financial genius Martin Bormann, since Ab's private bank was the very bank that managed the accounts for the Reichschancellery and thus paid Adolf Hitler's salary as Chancellor. 2. The wider context of the post-war Nazi International and the name Bilderberger Group. But there is a deeper implication to Ab's presence at the Bilderberg meetings, along with fellow IG Farben officer Prince Bernhard, than even this friendly relationship with Martin Bormann would indicate. This deeper implication is clearly suggested by the role that Deutsche Bank played in moving the massive amount of funds overseas that were a component of Martin Bormann's strategic evacuation plan, first outlined for the Nazi and German corporate leadership at a top-secret meeting held in Strasbourg, France, in August of 1944. As I wrote in one of my previous books, Nazi International, 7 things emerged as a consequence of this meeting. 1. Bormann basically confiscated any foreign reserves in the possession of German corporations and placed them under the control of the Nazi Party. 2. These funds in turn would be dispersed to corporations in aid of their fulfillment of the goals of the conference. 3. One primary goal was to establish research bureaus whose purpose, following the IG Farben NW7 model, was to gather intelligence and steal foreign research as well as to conduct their own research. 4. Since these technical offices were to have their own Nazi Party liaison officer reporting directly to Bormann, it is clear that Bormann intended for his Nazi International to conduct not only espionage, but research in its own right, under departments, the technical offices of German corporations only very loosely connected to them. 5. Each such research bureau was to be established under a cloak of other activities, such as investigating water sources. 6. The capital flight program was designed to see to it that Allied authorities did not get the most valuable German scientists. So as you know, some of you might know Project Paperclip. That was the whole idea of that, for example, where certain scientists were brought over because of the rocket programs they were doing, some of them led by Werner von Braun, so on and so forth. So, and then several other things, which some indicate that that was how NASA was founded, our space agency. But if you look at some, because a lot of people look at these kind of books here, like conspiracy theories, right? And so, which some people might just look at it as pure fantasy, which is fine. It's entertaining all in itself. The fact that people can string together these ideas and make these kind of conclusions that may or may not be true. But you have some interesting things that do parallel things that you will find in fiction, specifically movies, that if you look at them from this perspective, you can see that at least the author of this book is not alone in making these connections. For the fact that if you look at the first Captain America movie and also Hellboy, where the Germans were well known for doing lots of occult and scientific research to try to open up like different portals and to find exotic forms of energy, and basically to get themselves ahead of the rest of the world with these different types of technologies. So, all right. So let's see. So 6, the capital flight program was designed to see to it that Allied authorities did not get the most valuable German scientists, technicians, or knowledge as represented in patents, all of which were to be transferred overseas to safe havens, thus indicating that Bormann, in the light of all the previously enumerated considerations, intended for the party to continue an independent line of scientific research under its own control, all the while managing and sharing any information gained through its espionage activities with the involved German corporations as the party and Bormann saw fit. Right, so, of course, again, referring to Captain America and those things like that, this arm would be, is what Hydra is, right? The Nazi rogue science division, right? Which is why the United States had their own strategic scientific reserve, which Captain America was part of when he took that super soldier serum. Okay, and all this implies something else, something very obvious and very significant. 7. Martin Bormann fully intended to survive the war in order to coordinate all these activities. Note the significant point of establishing research bureaus under the direction of Nazi Party liaison officers who, in turn, gathered intelligence, oversaw ongoing post-war Nazi research activities, and who reported directly to Bormann. By extension, then, the presence of SS officer Prince Bernhard as not only a founder of the Bilderberger Group, but as the first chairman of its first meeting, and the presence of Bormann's banker, Dr. Hermann Joseph Abs, in later meetings, himself a Farben director, along with Prince Bernhard, is a strong indicator that the Bilderberg Group may have been founded as yet another liaison office for Bormann's Nazi International, allowing it not only the opportunity to sit down behind closed doors and exchange information with its chief rival for power, the Anglo-American banking elite, but to maintain a constant flow of intelligence on its activities and goals. It was, in short, a marriage of convenience to move and launder massive amounts of money through the Anglo-American elites, corporations, and banks. And, as with all such deals with the devil, Bormann's money also carried with it the implied threat that someday the markers would come due. There is some corroborative evidence for this interpretation even in Estulin's book itself. So Estulin, he's another writer on the Bilderberger. He's a Bilderberger researcher. Most reports contend the original members named their alliance the Bilderberg Group after the hotel where they made their covenant. Author Georgos C. Hatton, however, discovered that German-born Prince Bernhard was an officer in the Reiter SS Corp in the early 1930s and was on the board of an IG Farben subsidiary, Farben Bilder. In his book, Rape of the Constitution, Death of Freedom, Hatton claims Prince Bernhard drew on his Nazi history in corporate management to encourage the super-secret policy-making group to call themselves the Bilderbergers, after Farben Bilder, in memory of the Farben executives' initiative to organize Heinrich Himmler's Circle of Friends, elite wealth-building leaders who amply rewarded Himmler for his protection under the National Socialist programs from the early days of Hitler's popularity through to Nazi Germany's defeat. The royal Dutch family discreetly buried this part of Prince Bernhard's background when, after the war, he became a top official in Royal Dutch Shell, a Dutch-British conglomerate. Today, this rich European oil company forms part of the inner circle of the Bilderberg elite. However, Estulin leaves matters, never to return to the potential implications this information signals. These potential implications are signaled once again by Ab's presence as a Bilderberger, and to see what it is, we have to look a little closer at the post-war relationship between him, Bormann, and the North American faction of the Bilderberg Group that is implicated in a little-known incident. 3. An event indicative of an understanding between the Anglo-American corporate globalist elite and the Nazi International. This incident is a clear indicator that the Bilderberg Group's early founding was for the purposes of striking a kind of détente between the two old rivals, the Nazi International and the Anglo-American elite, since both shared similar goals and both had access to a lot of money. The incident was disclosed by longtime CBS journalist and Ed Morrow associate Paul Manning in his book Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. Manning recounts a little-known effort by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Jackson, who had obtained fame as America's chief prosecutor during the Nuremberg war crimes tribunals and President Harry S. Truman to track down the Nazi Party Reichsleiter. I recounted this effort in my book, The Nazi International, as follows. Paul Manning, a journalist and longtime associate and friend of the famous CBS newsman Ed Morrow, mentioned Bormann's presence in Bariloche province, but did not connect his appearance with the Richter fusion project. Manning begins by noting that President Truman himself became involved in the hunt for Bormann in 1948, 3 long years after Bormann supposedly died trying to escape Berlin. According to the official standard history, on June 16, 1948, President Truman became involved in the hunt for Martin Bormann. Robert H. Jackson, who had once taken a leave from the Supreme Court to serve as U.S. Chief Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, wrote to the President that a quiet search should be made by the FBI for Bormann in South America. My suggestion, therefore, he wrote, is that the FBI be authorized to pursue thoroughly discreet inquiries of a preliminary nature in South America. I have submitted this summary to Mr. Hoover and am authorized to say that it meets with his approval. You may inform him of your wishes directly or through me, as you prefer. The choice of the FBI to do the investigation is perhaps significant. Under American federal law, after Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 that created the CIA and NSA, the FBI was restricted to intelligence operations on American soil. All operations on foreign soil fell under the jurisdiction of the CIA. So why would Jackson have urged President Truman to undertake an investigation in South America through the FBI? After all, Truman himself signed the law into existence and knew full well its contents. The answer lies once again in the fact that the CIA, which under Zurich OSS Station Chief Alan Dulles during the war, had negotiated a highly secret deal with the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front, General Reinhard Gehlen, to turn over, lock, stock, and Nazi, Gehlen's entire network to the nominal oversight of the American intelligence community, leaving Gehlen in charge of its actual day-to-day operations. In other words, before the ink was even dry on the National Security Act of 1947, the CIA's civilian character had already been compromised in the most egregious way, since its entire operational desk in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, and to a great extent elsewhere as well, was staffed by a network of Nazis. Needless to say, then, the CIA would not be the best instrumentality to investigate Bormann's possible presence in Latin America. Jackson's request also suggests something even darker, that both he and Truman knew of the extent of Nazi penetration of the CIA, and therefore of its untrustworthiness as an investigative agency for post-war Nazi activity. Again, you see also, if any of you are fans of the Marvel comic books or seen the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I only say this because you see how people have access to this information and understand, like, for example, that the Hydra, the Nazi rogue science division, has this exact scenario in the Winter Soldier, right, where that the Hydra has infiltrated very deeply into the, as he calls it in this book, the Anglo-American elite, right, in the government, whereas Hydra took over completely. They had the head of Hydra, of the Security Council, right, was in fact Hydra, and so many of the top officials were Hydra in that movie, which were, of course, again the rogue Nazi science division. Continuing, in any case, as Manning observes, the presidential authorization was given, and John Edgar Hoover signed the investigation to his most experienced and skillful agent in South America, who proved that he was just that by eventually obtaining copies of the Martin Bormann file that were being held under strict secrecy by Argentina's Minister of the Interior in the Central de Inteligencia. When the file, now in my possession, was received at FBI headquarters, it revealed that the Reichsleiter had indeed been tracked for years. One report covered his whereabouts from 1948 to 1961 in Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, and Chile. The file revealed that he had been banking under his own name from his office in Germany in Deutsche Bank of Buenos Aires since 1941, that he held one joint account with the Argentinian dictator Juan Perón, and on August 4th, 5th, and 14th, 1967, had written checks on demand accounts in First National City Bank, the overseas division of New York, the Chase Manhattan Bank, and Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company, all cleared through Deutsche Bank of Buenos Aires. Bormann's wartime contact with Deutsche Bank bigwig Dr. Herman Abs and the connections to the international financial interests of Morgan and Rockefeller via their big New York banks was paying big dividends, for Bormann quite apparently did not even have to hide his identity, but could sign and cash checks under his own name through some of the largest and well-known banks in America as late as 1967. Let's see, what is this here? I receive a text message. Asistis. Ah, ha 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 ha. Yes, 333. Which is one of the calls to action to balance mind, body, and spirit. Thank you, Cecilia. All right, so let's see. Who's in here? Hello, Cecilia Grace, Eric Lane, Marcy Ann, hello, Terry, Lois Hampson, Mojo, and Zoe. Welcome. All right, continuing. So yes, he was able to cash checks under his own name through some of the largest and most well-known banks in America as late as 1967. So observe carefully the dynamic here. 1. Bormann has accounts after the war in large American banks representing the Rockefeller-Morgan interest. 2. He is able to draft checks on those accounts and cash them under his own name 22 years after the war, after the end of the war. 3. Those checks are cleared through his bank, Deutsche Bank, through its local Buenos Aires office in Argentina. All right, so we have thus a Bormann-Abs-Rockefeller network, and this clearly implies that the two financial elites represented by their respective delegations to those early Bilderberg meetings have reached some sort of modus vivendi. The question is why. So just to backtrack, I want to take note that the author has in his possession this file, where the file that is that shows these banking connections. Apparently, some things are declassified, and we as citizens can get our hands on these things. Continuing, 4. Closed systems, open systems, and further possible reasons for the detente. A clue to the answer is afforded in part by so this is answering the question where he says, we have thus a Bormann-Abs-Rockefeller network, and this clearly implies that the two financial elites represented by their respective delegations to those early Bilderberg meetings have reached some sort of modus vivendi. The question is why. A clue to the answer is afforded in part by the fact that the immediate post-war goals of the Nazi International and the Anglo-American elite are one and the same: the creation of a European federation under German economic dominance. Jim Marrs, in his best-selling book, The Rise of the Fourth Reich, puts it this way. After the war, a devastated Europe looked to Germany for economic leadership. The economic steps taken that became the common market took the shape of pre-war Nazi plans. Somehow, the Germans had the answer originally in 1942 when they were melding the economic institutions of the continent into their own design, noted Manning. It is interesting to note that the present European Union began as merely economic measures. The European Economic Community, better known as the Common Market, was established in 1957 by the Treaty of Rome. George McGee, a member of the secretive Bilderberg Group and former U.S. ambassador to West Germany, acknowledged that the Treaty of Rome, which brought the common market into being, was nurtured at Bilderberg meetings. And needless to say, the ultimate goal of world domination was a goal shared by both the North American faction and the Nazi International, and hence both could afford to make common sense, to come to an agreement of detente and coexistence at those first Bilderberg group meetings. But there is yet another reason why such a detente was not only sought by both factions, but in a sense altogether necessary. Money. The rebuilding of Europe, not to mention its integration, would require money, and lots of it. And there were two groups, the North American Bilderberg faction and the Nazi International, that had it in abundance. For Bormann to grow the substantial monies that his Nazi party had plundered from Europe, he would have to have access to the international banking community and its banks in Britain and North America. Conversely, such vast influx of liquid cash and hard commodities such as gold, diamonds, and platinum, which Bormann's Nazi International had in abundance, would constitute a reserve that would greatly expand the Rockefeller-Morgan-Rothschild banks, their ledger credit-making ability, enriching them in the process. It was inevitably a detente made in Banksters' heaven, and Bilderberg was the result. There is, however, a final reason for the detente, one that once again demonstrates the deep connection of finance and physics. For Bormann's Nazi International to maintain this detente for such a long period after the war, after all, according to Manning and the Argentine Intelligence Service, he cashed checks on Rockefeller-Morgan banks via Deutsche Bank in 1967. He would have to have had powerful coercive leverage with which to ensure that the Anglo-American faction lived up to its part of the deal. Part of this, no doubt, came from the implicit threat afforded by the vast intelligence resources available to him. General Gellen's old German military intelligence unit, now the nucleus of West Germany's Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Nazi Party's own significant intelligence network, and so on. Let's see if I got that word right. Bundesnachrichtendienst. 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 The Nazi Party's own significant intelligence network, and so on. The mere existence of such a network would convey the threat that if the other faction did not behave according to their agreements, its leaders could be very easily assassinated. There is, however, another bit of leverage Bormann's Nazi International controlled, and it was one piece of leverage that its rival North American faction dearly wished to possess: alternative physics. Over the course of the 4 previous books on wartime Nazi secret weapons research, Reich of the Black Sun, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, Secrets of the Unified Field, and the Nazi International, I have detailed the story of the Nazi Bell device, a hyper-dimensional physics device being researched under the auspices of the SS department's Entwicklungsstelle 4 Division, or Development Area 4, Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, Research, Development, and Patents, and SS General Hans Kammler's secret weapons black projects think tank, the Kammerstab, as the mission brief of the Entwicklungsstelle 4 was to develop free energy and to make Germany independent of foreign oil, and as the latter 2 departments were responsible for the Bell itself, a device I believe to have been designed for a threefold purpose: to investigate that same free energy, to explore the possibilities of advanced field propulsion concepts, and finally, as a weapon that had the potential to make even the largest thermonuclear bombs pale by comparison for destructive potential. This device and the alternative physics it represented and embodied were a clear threat to the closed systems approach of at least the North American faction within the Bilderberg Group and similar groups. As I also detail in the Nazi International, Bormann saw to it that while the Allies and Soviets received an almost equal and stalemating division of the technological spoils of the Third Reich, this device he retained for the Nazi International and continued a line of independent investigation of its physics. So again, remember, it's not like this stuff is any secret if you haven't even heard it before. Sometimes when you're looking at fantasy and fiction, a lot of these things, a lot of people, researchers, know about, or at least consider them to be interesting conspiracy theories because they're in movies. Like this multi-dimensional device and things like that, right? What did he call it here? Different free energy systems, advanced propulsion concepts, and different things like that, right? If you look at Hellboy, that's exactly what the Nazi scientists were doing. They were opening up another dimension. What he called it was a hyperdimensional physics here. Yeah, he says, I've detailed the story of the Nazi Bell device. So the Nazi Bell device is a hyperdimensional physics device, right? And hyperdimensional physics is what was being used in Hellboy in order to open up that portal which Hellboy came through. And also all kinds of other monsters and shit, right? All right, so good. So continuing. So this independent investigation was headquartered in Argentina, near the remote city of San Carlos de Bariloche, in Rio Negro province. Argentina would be Rio. I was pronouncing it in the Brazilian Portuguese way. It's Rio Negro province, some 900 miles south of Buenos Aires. Ostensibly a project investigating techniques for controlling thermonuclear fusion, it had evidently achieved some success, as dictator Juan Perón made an announcement in 1951 to this effect. Further investigation, however, revealed that the ultimate goal of the project was far beyond this, as the project's head, Dr. Ronald Richter, viewed controlled fusion and plasma processes as a way to manipulate the zero-point energy, the fabric of space-time itself. For our purposes here, however, it is important to note that the United States shows an interest in Richter's project for some 4 years after it was shut down by Bormann and his Nazi International. This fact, plus the fact, according to Bell researcher Igor Witkowski, that after the war, the United States made every effort to reconstruct the personnel team that worked on the Bell, and that it also even went so far as to launch a military commando raid into Czechoslovakia in 1946 to recover documents doubtless relating to General Kammler's secret weapons group. This is a strong indication that the Anglo-American faction knew in general fashion of the existence of this alternative physics in post-war Nazi hands and was attempting to recover as much of it for themselves as possible and break Bormann's monopoly hold over it and restore a balance of power, albeit a covert one, between the two factions. Needless to say, there is also every indication that the Soviets and Allies began a crash program after the war to investigate similar lines of physics for themselves. It's interesting. I don't know what he's going to say next about a crash program, but as I was reading that, it brought to mind Roswell and how one of my hypotheses about all of this stuff coming about with the United States revealing and saying that, yes, we've seen UFOs, our military pilots and such have tracked them and found them on radar and so on and so forth, that I've always held the line that these are actually human-powered vehicles along the line of Richard Dolan's breakaway civilizations, which are civilizations or what do you call them, extraterritorial civilizations that are in possession of a different kind of physics than what is commonly used, for example, in the very, what I call ancient technology of rocket propulsion, which uses Newton's classical physics, third law of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction blasting out through the nozzle of the fuel to push back the equal and opposite reaction to push a rocket into space. Whereas if you see things outlined in, for example, the recently deceased Paul A. LaViolette's book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, which uses electrogravitics, propulsion is not even necessary. That's why even anti-gravity propulsion is a misnomer, because it doesn't use propulsion in the Newtonian third law type of way. It creates an independent gravity field using a gravity well, which is what we commonly know as pulling us towards things, like going down into a well, and the newly discovered, or actually newly released, understanding of gravity as a gravity hill, which pushes simultaneously, therefore dampening the inertia for all the occupants within the vehicle so that they can go up speeds up to the speed of light and beyond, as some experiments have shown, sending signals 40 times and sometimes more than the speed of light, which would be known as tachyons. But I digress from that, geeking out a little bit. Let's go back to Babylon's Banksters. So needless to say, there's also every indication that the Soviets and Allies began a crash program after the war to investigate a similar lines of physics for themselves. A crash program. This indicates a possible final reason for the detente. Bormann's Nazi International could literally dangle portions of that physics and its cognate technologies before his erstwhile allies' noses and dole it out piecemeal, if he so chose, in return for favors. And this hints at a potential internal dynamic within the factions represented by the Bilderberg Group, for each faction would seek not only to suppress public development of such physics and technologies, but also seek to inhibit the other faction's development of it as well. 5. An analogy of the detente, the 1939 Nazi-Soviet Pact. An apt analogy of this situation is afforded by the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, the pact that secretly divided Poland into Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence and made World War II possible. Both regimes, being what they were, both took cynical advantage of the geopolitical situation, fully knowing that at some future time the two nations would probably come to blows. The pact was simply a détente, a coexistence wherein both sides agreed not to go to war with each other, allowing a period of time during which each could build up its forces to do precisely that. For reasons that were in part outlined in the prologue and to be explored subsequently, this author believes that within the last decade or so, keep in mind this book is 2010, this author believes that within the last decade or so, there are distinct signs that the post-war détente within the Bilderberg Group is breaking down, and that there is quiet, though very serious, covert war being waged between the various factions of that international corporate elite. 6. Closed systems, globalization, new energy sources, and outer space. But what are the practical implications of this closed system approach to physics and economics? Well, let him tell us. For the conspirators adopting them and imposing them on the rest of the world, they are very simple. In the first instance, that of globalization, a closed global economic order will eventually devour itself, and therewith the conspirators themselves. Knowing this, they have two possible alternatives. 1. Development of new energy sources which they can monopolize, a risky prospect as we shall see, or 2, they can open the system up a bit and venture into outer space, creating a potential competitor while simultaneously promoting factional and regional imbalances on the Earth which they can manipulate and control and maintain the illusion that the economy is perking along nicely, as they have done in the past. Both components of this stratagem are themselves fraught with risks as well, for in promoting regional imbalances and factional infighting, they run the risk that they will eventually lose control of them, and that the unitary closed global system will fragment, and their power will be correspondingly diminished. D. Conclusions and implications. So what may one conclude from this examination of the real purposes behind the Bilderberg Group? As we have seen, the following points now evidence themselves. 1. There is a deep and profound connection between the closed systems approach of finance and politics advocated by such international groups of the corporate elite and closed system physics. 2. This connection necessitates that any internal factions within it seek to suppress the open and public development of such physics, as well as to monopolize it for themselves and deny it to other factions. 3. Any such group must also seek to extend its influence over the other areas of power, academia, labor, and, as we saw from David Rockefeller's remarks, religion. This will figure prominently in Part 2 in our examination of why ancient temples functioned also as centers for the then banking class. 4. In the wake of World War II, an apparent détente was struck between two major factions, the Anglo-American and the Nazi International or European faction. As a result of the pressing need for channeling vast amounts of Nazi plunder back into Europe, and as the North American group and the European group each used the meetings to gather intelligence on the other and keep abreast of its activities. With these observations, we have seen at one end of the historical pole the interrelationships of closed and open systems, of the banking elite, and of the necessity for it to suppress the development of open systems physics that would lead to open financial systems. We have moreover suggested that there is serious factional polarization and tension within that class, hiding just beneath the surface and able to break out into open conflict given certain circumstances. It is now time to press our examination a little further back into history, toward the Great Depression, and a hidden, little known, and little appreciated legacy of one of America's most unpopular presidents. Thereby, we will be afforded the perspective by which to perceive quite clearly the interrelationships of physics and economics itself, and to track that relationship even further back into history. All right, so part 2 coming up is Hoover's Hidden Legacy and Gift, Indicators of a Lost Science. You've been listening to Babylon's Banksters, Unusual Guests, presented by Hakeem Alibokis Alexander on Spreaker Social Podcasting and Wisdom Social Audio Inc., presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM. Coming up next in just a few will be part 2 of Babylon's Banksters. Starts off with Hoover's Hidden Legacy and Gift, Indicators of a Lost Science.